Hey guys, it's JM here at Disciple Dojo, and in our new office slash guest room, home office. But I wanted to start doing something periodically here on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook, wherever I post this. I wanted to share some of my favorite insights from books that I've read over the years. I believe that we should, as a society, read way more than we do currently, and that's one of the problems that we're having in social discourse, in being able to talk, understand other people, to debate, to argue with each other, to persuade one another, or just to get along with people that don't agree with us. And I think that reading all types of literature, all types of writings, all types of viewpoints is always a good thing. So I wanted to start sharing just periodically some little passages or highlights from books that are pretty meaningful to me. Just stuff that when I read, I always read with a highlighter in one hand. And so these are some of the things that I've come across as highlights that I want to share with those of you who listen and follow this ministry. But the first one that I want to do this is actually from probably my favorite fiction, one of my favorite fiction books of all time. And this is C.S. Lewis's book, Perelandra. And it's the second in his Space Trilogy series. And the Space Trilogy is a story of this philologist named Ransom who gets kidnapped in the first novel out of the Silent Planet. He gets basically shanghaied by some mad scientist types to what ends up being Mars. And it's science fiction, but it's theological philosophy in science fiction, because while Ransom's on Mars, he encounters basically how the Martian creatures, how they view and worship creation or the creator or the gods or whatever you want to term it. And so then the next book, Perelandra, the second book in it, is he's back on Earth. He actually gets taken to Venus. And the way Lewis's Space Trilogy sets it up, the further out planets are older and the closer in planets are younger. So Mars is older than Earth. Venus is younger than Earth. And so Ransom is sent to Venus to basically meet the Venusian versions of Adam and Eve, the first man and the woman of Venus. And he's sent there at a critical moment when the equivalent of what on Earth was the serpent in the garden, which is in Venus, is embodied not by a serpent, but by one of the scientists who took him to Mars, who also makes his way to Venus. Basically, he's sent there to be the voice that counters the voice of the serpent. And so in the book, it's a fantastic book with all kinds of insane visuals. I mean, they could only make this now if they made it into a movie, because of the visuals that are depicted. Venus is this was all before space travel. You know, Lewis wrote these back in the, I believe back in the 50s. And it basically takes a guess at what the other planets are like. And so in Lewis's account, Venus is this watery world that its islands are like floating islands that float on the surface of these waves, and so everything's very fluid, everything's new, and it's just this really cool setting. But in the climax of the story, I won't give spoilers too much, but at one point Ransom realizes, after he's exhausted all of his reason in trying to reason with the Venus version of Eve, why she shouldn't obey the voice of the unman, as he calls him. He's not a man, but he's not a creature. He's a man, but he's not a man. So he calls him the unman. And after basically telling the woman, this is why you shouldn't listen to the voice of the unman, and the unman actually countering back with arguments on why she should listen to him, because God really wants her to do that, because he's testing her. And it's this really elaborate, very insidious, if you like Screwtape, you'd really appreciate the unman scenes of dialogue in Perelandra. But the point, my favorite point in the whole book, is when finally all that's exhausted and Ransom realizes reason is not going to work here. And he actually has to, reason's been exhausted. And now comes the point, the woman has to make the decision on her own, and she makes the decision. But now his job is to physically confront and bring judgment upon, to destroy the unman. And he's not a warrior, he's not a fighter, he's a middle-aged philologist. He works in a university. And so there's a whole scene where they're fighting and struggling, and the unman is in the body of another middle-aged academic. And so it's these two middle-aged academics that don't really know how to fight, but they're having to fight each other. And at the climax, uh, basically he realizes, Ransom says, I'll read you this moment. Lewis says, then he remembers, as one remembers an island of consciousness preceded and followed by long anesthesia, going forward to meet the unman for what seemed like the thousandth time, and knowing clearly that he could not fight much more. He remembers seeing the enemy for a moment looking not like Weston, but like a mandrill, and realizing almost at once that this was delirium. He wavered. Then an experience that perhaps no good man can ever have in our world came over him. A torrent of perfectly unmixed and lawful hatred. The energy of hating, never before felt without some guilt, without some dim knowledge that he was failing fully to distinguish the sinner from the sin, rose into his arms and legs, till he felt that they were pillars of burning blood. What was before him appeared no longer a creature of corrupted will. It was corruption itself, to which will was attached only as an instrument. Ages ago it had been a person, but the ruins of personality now survived in it only as weapons at the disposal of a furious, self-exiled negation. It is perhaps difficult to understand why this filled Ransom not with horror, but with a kind of joy. The joy came from finding at last what hatred was made for. As a boy with an axe rejoices on finding a tree, or a boy with a box of colored chalks rejoices on finding a pile of perfectly white paper, so he rejoiced in the perfect congruity between his emotion and its object. I love that line. He finally realizes, even of all the emotions that we can feel here on earth, what Lewis suggests is that hatred is always one that even at its best is tinged with sin, because whenever we are hating somebody else or hating a person, we're still hating one in the image of God. But what Lewis posits here, in Perelandra at least, at this moment in the battle between Ransom and the unman, is the humanity of Weston has now been completely done away with, and Ransom actually gets a vision of pure, unadulterated corruption itself. And he rejoices that thing that he's always felt, this we all feel that temptation to hate thing. There are things that we hate, and I don't mean like I hate, pecans, or I hate, romance comedies, or I hate whatever it is you hate. I don't really hate either of those, but the thing there are some things in this world that we actually genuinely should hate, but it's hard because they're always enmeshed or intertangled with an element of humanity. So we hate human trafficking, but we do, as Christians, love even those people who are caught up in it, victimizing others, because we see that there's a fallen, twisted reflection of God's image, even in the worst sinner on earth, the worst criminal, the worst abuser. But what Lewis does is he's able to take us out of this world and to a world unspoiled by sin so far, outside of Weston's character, outside of the unman, and lets us realize that in a world such as that there deep down is something out there worth hating. That the concept of hate and revulsion actually fits, and it's that thing. It's that utter evil. He visualizes it brilliantly with Weston's character, with the unman. But I love this passage, and it gives me a lot to think about, because the question is, what do we do with our real emotions, our bad emotions, our dark emotions? Things like hatred. Everybody does hate, and what Lewis suggests, and he just hints at it and dances around. He never explores it other than this one moment in this climax of the book. But what he suggests is even hatred is what we know of as earthly hatred is a distortion of an originally good thing. Lewis would say in Mere Christianity that goodness is itself. Evil is just spoiled goodness. And there has to be something good before it can become spoiled. So evil is a parasite. It has no life of its own. There are some things that once they've taken and completely distorted and twisted and crushed out all of the goodness, all of the what once was redeemable, that there's some things that is not only lawful, but it is actually the righteous thing to do, to hate that thing. And of course, how do we balance that with the call to love our enemies? How do we love the sinner but really truly hate what sin does to the person and to others? That's the challenge. That's the challenge of discipleship. That's the challenge of theological reflection, of looking at everyone through the eyes of God. Because we know that there are things that God does hate. He says in Scripture, I hate, and there are a few things that he says. Look those up. There's your homework for the day. But that's the challenge that we have is how do we hate those things but never turn that hatred onto a person who bears the image of God, unlike the Unman in Lewis's novel. So check it out. Read don't read Perelandra first. Read Out of the Silent Planet first. These are short books too. I read them in high school. But read Out of the Silent Planet and then read Perelandra and see what you think. I'd love to hear in the comments if you have read the book. So we'll do some more of these in the future, but I just wanted to throw this one out here and see how it goes. You guys interact. Be sure to subscribe, Disciple Dojo on YouTube. Also to our podcast on SoundCloud and iTunes and Stitcher. Just type in Disciple Dojo, and that's where you can find us. Thanks, guys. Take care.